So my name is Caleb Funk. If you haven't been on one of these with me before, I'll tell you just a little bit about myself. I've been with IMAGINiT for over 20 years now and worked in a variety of roles with IMAGINiT. I always say I've done just a little bit of everything here. So I've done training and implementations and people management and project management. But a large part of what I do is exactly what we're doing today, which is to take a look at different possibilities for working with clients in terms of software or processes or training or implementations, whatever it might be. So that's a little bit about me, a little bit about IMAGINiT. So IMAGINiT is we're actually part of a larger organization called RAND Worldwide. We're one of the divisions there. And it's really beneficial. Like I always tell people, hey, I've been here 20 years. There must be a reason why. I have really enjoyed working with IMAGINiT for a lot of the reasons that you're going to see here. We work very closely with Autodesk as a platinum partner. We have a huge dedicated staff of technical experts. That's been really useful to me personally, and it's always useful to our clients because a lot of times I'll talk to people and say, look, I might not know the answer, but I bet I know somebody who does. We're able to find that information because of that deep industry expertise and that dedicated staff of experts that we have. 22,000 plus customers across mostly North America. You see our offices as we're spread out there. I'm one of those dots sitting in Toledo, Ohio. And we just have a lot of experience and a really deep understanding of how CAD tools are used within different industries. Manufacturing is my personal specialty that I work with. I mentioned the idea of just the people that we're a part of. We have a huge staff of technical experts. I love the stat that says 1,000 years of combined experience. I'm not sure who did the math. I haven't done it myself, but it wouldn't shock me. It's probably true. And we've got dedicated data management, PLM, facilities management, simulation consulting, software development teams. So we actually have, when we talk about data management, I'm going to talk about it for kind of this large top level 50,000 foot view of this. This actually gets pretty deep, and we have people that can do that, can get very deep into those topics. So it's a little bit about me, a little bit about IMAGINiT, but what we're actually here to talk about and take a look at is the idea of PDM, the data management in general. And it was presented to me, and they said, hey, we want to let's talk about the overview of data management, and the term holistic came up, right? Looking at it as a complete piece and all that goes along with that. I said, okay, so what is that where's that at in my head, looking at this as this big broad overview? And a lot of times, if you're trying to either get into data management tools for the first time, or maybe you have some and you're looking to expand it, there's so many directions it can go. And it kind of feels like this when you first take a look at it. At a glance, it's like, well, yep, there's a little bit of this, a little bit of that, all these things we have to keep in line and really, really think about. And I want to step back, take a breath, and reduce it to some simpler ideas. Because while all of this is definitely a part of it, this is, looking at these at a granular level sometimes doesn't get us where we want to go. We maybe need to look at this in a simpler terms. So when it comes to data management, it's really about three different things. The first is the files themselves. So this could be CAD files, could be documentation, could be PDF, DWF files, but we want to manage the files, right? It's right in the topic, data management. That's what we want to concern ourselves with. Now, it's only one piece of it. This is the one we typically think of right off the bat. And if you've used Vault Basic, used a tool like that, this is kind of where you come in. Honestly, if you're using a Windows file server, you're using this level of data management, managing those files. But the next thing to consider, the next piece that really makes this up, is the idea of the metadata. So that's the information about the files. It can be data from the file, the date it was created, who created it, the software it was created in, the last time it was saved. Or it could be data added to the file. Typically, the way we would do that with Inventor would be with iProperties. We could do it with AutoCAD, with pulling information from the title block, or we could just add the information to the file in a data management tool. This is kind of where we get away from a Windows system, right? There's some metadata there. I can go do a search. I can find file names, but we don't have as much access to that metadata. So the digital files, the metadata, and then the processes around that. How do you access those files? Who can access those files? Do we limit this by groups? How do I know who has access to those files? How do I know who has the file right now? To me, it's those three things together that really make up a data management system. So I don't want to say software there, because we can put digital files into a software. That's great. We can track the metadata in the software. That's great. The software can help automate those processes, but the processes are defined by your company, by you. You say, this is who we're going to allow to access it. This is when it can be accessed. This is how we can go through and get that information. That's kind of how a lot of this comes together when we take a look at that. So software is part of the answer, but it isn't the answer. And this is something I'll tell, a lot of times we'll be talking with people, and before we talk about software, a lot of times we want to talk about, well, how, why, what are we doing here and why are we doing it? So that's what we're going for and what we're taking a look at. So if we want to implement, if we have an issue with data management where we've got a bunch of digital files, we have information, and we want to begin controlling this, what are some options for setting this up and how do we access this? Well, the first option, and this is true in almost any environment, is to do nothing, right? So the pros of doing nothing is it's easy to budget for, very manageable staffing requirements, and can be accomplished with existing hardware and software. The downside is it doesn't solve any problems, but it's always attractive, right? A lot of times when we have some sort of issue with data management, files are being accessed wrong, we can't find the files that we need, we're having to redraw parts because we can't find the one in time. The easiest thing is just to do nothing and kind of go on from there. The other option, and this is really common, is some sort of smart file naming or smart folder structure. And this is, if I'm using a Windows-based server and I'm going out and I'm trying to, I suddenly realize we've got a whole bunch of files and we need to be able to find these, right? This is a good way to start. And people a lot of times will start there because this is easy to budget. We could say, hey, we're going to name these files a certain way. You don't need a whole lot of specialty software or hardware to do it, right? We can say we're going to rename the files, we're going to take care of this. But the downside is this can be a long project. A lot of times, I've talked to clients who spend a year coming up with the right smart file naming system or the right folder structure. So it can take a long time to implement. It can be difficult to explain to new users. This is something very commonly we'll go out and talk to clients and they're walking me through and I'm like, okay, and then and then after the dash that stands for this, and it's complicated enough that it's difficult to explain. It does not address the metadata and searching issue. If I want to, remember one of the three things I said, there's the files themselves, but then there's the idea of the metadata. That's not really being addressed by this. We are a little, because we've got a smart file name that we can search on, but the extended metadata, when was the file created? Who created it? When was it last edited? Who checked it in? It's not part of this. And this doesn't necessarily address access issues. We can limit access using some Windows access ideas, but we don't have true full check-in and check-out capability, and we don't have a sense of who was the last that edited it. So access issues are still there. So then the third option, which is what we're going to kind of look at today, is the idea of a dedicated data management tool. Right? We now have a single source of truth, one location for all the files. They all go here. We can leverage the metadata within the files for searching and finding that information. And we can control access to those files. Who has them? Who had them last? When was it edited? All of those things. So there's a lot of advantage and a lot of value in what we're in implementing a tool like that. The downside of it is there's a cost of software, possibly, and there's typically a cost of implementation, putting it in place. And I'm going to return to that. But what we want to do is take a look at how Vault addresses those three key areas. The idea of having having the files, having the metadata about the files, and having access to them for check-in and check-out and accessing that. And part of the big idea behind this is being able to have tools that we can free up designers from these tasks they run into every day, right? And these tasks could be something as simple as finding a file, sharing a file with someone else, being able to pass that around. And the idea is we've got a single source that everyone can connect to. We've got everyone linking up to the same file network, the same information, so that we can begin to pull this together. So let's take a look at what some of these pieces are that I'm going to talk about within this tool set. One, fast data searching. To me, this is one of the keys in my mind of why we would begin to incorporate that. And there's the files themselves and the metadata about the files. This is the metadata, being able to go find those files and look for that information. Ownership. Checking files in and checking files out. Understanding that here's how we access these files, who had the file, how do we get to it. All of that can be part of it. And as part of that, we have version tracking and design rollback. So now we've got, in those three, we've got the idea of metadata, we've got the idea of processes, and we have the idea of managing the files with version tracking. I mentioned the central location, always important. That's where we're going to put this information. And then there's doing some administrative tasks, such as renaming files, replacing files, swapping one out for the other, copying an entire design, taking a whole design as well as all its drawings that are associated to it, and being able to make a copy of those. So I'm going to play around just for a few minutes with some of these ideas within here. I'm going to pull up my Vault. We're going to kind of walk through it. And where I want to start is the tool we would call Vault Basic. And if you have the Product Design and Manufacturing Collection, this is part of your package today. Probably just hasn't been implemented yet if you're not using it. This is all here. It can be implemented. It's part of the tool set that you can begin to use. So give me just a second, and I'm going to pull up my Vault. Maybe, there we go. So I'm going to pull up my Vault, and we can take a look through here and see a little bit of how this works. So the first thing that I'll say, and we have files. So I've got files through here. And really, if I were just to look at this folder structure that I have over here to the left, this looks a whole lot to me like it would within Windows, right? So at this point, there's not much difference at all between looking at this within a designated PDM system, such as Vault Basic, or looking at this within Windows. That looks the same. That's how those tools work. Well, what I'm going to do, though, is I'm going to leverage what I have here. And I'm going to go search. I'm just going to search for the word cover. And the thing I'll point out is it's almost immediate. Vault is built on the file store. It's all the files. So that's the idea of the digital files themselves. And then a database behind those files. That's where the metadata is. So when I do a search for cover, it comes up with every time I've got the word cover in one of these file names. It went through, it found it, looks for cover, here we go. That fast searching, being able to find a component, find a part very quickly, this is one of the key pieces of that. Now in this case, I'm looking in the file name. It's a very simple search, went through the file name. I'm going to type the word steel, and I come up with a whole bunch of files that don't have steel anywhere in the file name. This is that extended metadata that I mentioned. This is the second part of a full data management system. There's the files, and now if I take a look, I've got this extended information about a particular file that I can go take a look at, including, in this case, its material. Oh, this in the description for this one, the description said steel. So Vault isn't looking just at the file names. Vault isn't looking just at the information that's quickly visible at a top level. It's looking at all of these properties to find that information. It's finding anywhere that steel shows up in there as part of that. Notice there's other information as well. Who was the designer, part number, engineer, all of that shows up within this design as part of that. So that search, and all I did was type in one word, and it looked through every file in my Vault, and it looked through every property that I had there to find that information. Now, I might want to be a little more specific. Maybe I don't want to look for steel in the comments. Maybe I don't want to look for steel in the description. I only want to look for it as a material. Well, I can expand this search, and now I can look in multiple properties, or I can look in a specific property, where I go down and look through only one particular property that I would want to have. So now if I run that same search, it's limiting me only to those who have steel as part of the material. I can also say, well, maybe I want to look for a specific creation date. Maybe I want to look for an author. Maybe I want to look for the last time it was worked on. All of that information is there, and it understands how where that is and can look through that. I'm going to do one more level of search here, just super quick. I'm going to do what's called a find. And in this case, again, I can search for a property, but I can use things such as contains, does not contain, is empty, is not empty. If I'm looking for something like a date, I can have on or before. I can put in a specific value. So I could say, well, I want to find that it was checked out before this particular date. And I'll add that to the list. And then I'll say, and the author contains cfunc, and the description contains bracket. My description. So I'll put in all of this different type of information here. So this is something that I run into all the time. I could say, well, I know I created this thing. I swear I created a part within the last 3 weeks. It was some kind of bracket, and it would match this perfectly. Finding that in a folder structure, or even worse, looking on maybe my hard drive and somebody else's hard drive, but thinking, man, I know I created a part that matches that. You leveraging the metadata is one of the key things, one of the key reasons why we would want to do that. One other quick thing I'll point out about the metadata is the fact that it understands how all of these files link together. So with Inventor, I would have the idea of a folder, an assembly with the parts that make up the assembly and go on down the line. That's stored in here as well. This is something that begins to fall apart with a Windows tool where it doesn't understand how the files link together. In this case, that extended metadata of how the files fit together is all part of this, and it understands where they are and how they fit. It goes both ways. I can look at a individual component and see where that component is linked in to the master assembly and follow it on up. And of course, that's really important because now if I work with the file, I understand how it's being affected by others. One other quick thing that I'm going to show here. So we've got the idea of managing the files. We've got the idea of being able to have the metadata about the files. But what I want to talk about is access. So over here in Inventor, I'm logging into my Vault. And when I go to log in, I'm just going to say, okay, sounds good. Let's log into that Vault. When I open up a file, and I'll just open up that blower I was looking at just a moment ago. When I open up a file, it's going to then bring that information to me. So I'm going to go grab it, say sounds good. It says this is not checked out. Do you want to check it out? So in a connected environment, does two things. Connected environment means more than one person is working in this assembly, in this design. So when I check this out, I now have the control of, I have control over it. Nobody else can change it but me. It's now signed out of Vault to Caleb. If anybody looks at it in Vault, they know Caleb has it, and that only I can access it, update it, and change it. Once I go through, make my updates, and I'm not really going to do any updates on this, but I'm just going to take this and check this back in. It now releases it so that other people can edit it, update, and change it. So we have that level of control over who has access to particular files at a particular time. We can check them out to work on them, check them back in when they're done, and that history is stored as part of the metadata. So the goal, the thing here is meeting each of those different requirements. Here's the history that I have of when I've checked that in and out and the different times that I've worked on that. My last one was 6/9/2022 at 1:21. So the idea is I'm meeting the requirements, those three key areas. And that's why these stand out to me as I take a look at this. Those key areas that I have of having the digital files. Yep, absolutely. That's one key piece of this. But then we also have the metadata associated to those files. And again, that's directly from the file itself, when it was checked in, when it was edited, where's it at? And then we have the processes, the check in, check out, who has access to how to access the files, who can access the files. So there's this idea of those three key pieces being brought together within Vault Basic so that we can control the access, have the files located in a single location, and be able to search on the information about those files so that we can easily find all of that. Now, there's productivity tools as well that are part of this. We can do copy designs. I mentioned the replace and the rename. One of the big key things for Vault for me is the fact that I don't have to manage the files myself in terms of where is this file located. I don't have to think in terms of if I rename it, do I have to update the assembly? Vault's going to manage that. But those are wonderful productivity tools. But the true idea of data management, being able to manage my data, these are the three pieces that I'm really looking at. Productivity tools that go beyond that are absolutely fantastic and really add overall to this, but these are the keys that I want to look at. So I mentioned the idea of working with, I said all of these things are Vault Basic, being able to have the idea of the productivity in terms of searching, the ownership, the location, and then the productivity tools that go with that. I do want to point out that there is a level beyond that. And this goes further into processes and into metadata. So those areas where we can extend beyond just the idea of having the files themselves and being able to access those. So Vault Basic has everything I just showed. That is Vault Basic through and through. Searching for the files, central location, being able to check in and check out. If we look beyond that, we can have the idea of increased these other areas that comes in. So one of them would be the idea of revision control, lifecycle states. I'll point that out in a minute. And then very, very granular level of security that we can get into. We can go all the way down to a file and determine who can access it and who can't. But this metadata, this idea of revision metadata being on a file, where it's really just an enhancement of those three areas that I talked about earlier. In this case, this is information that we can put on a file, we can control access to it, and we can control what revision that particular file is at. So again, I'm just going to jump back into my Vault so that I can kind of pull up some idea of what we'd be talking about with that. So if you take a look at all the files that I have here, these files are all listed as work in progress, and I have a revision associated to them. Both of these pieces of information, this is metadata about the files. I've got the file itself. Here's the extended metadata about it. And then I'm going to go through and I'm going to go ahead and change the state of this file that I have. And I'm going to change it to released. When I do, two things are going to happen. It's going to update the metadata here. It's going to change the state to released. It's going to it's going to put a padlock on it. It's going to change the access. So this is a process that I'm working with. I'm updating the metadata to control a process for my for working with these vaulted files and working with this data management tool. So now I have this locked down. It is released. It cannot be edited. It is a complete file. It's done. I can come back though and change it if I need to edit that to work in progress. Again, I'm changing basically a tag on here, what state it's in. It is going to then work with the process. It's going to automatically bump my revision, and it's going to make it an accessible file. So I'm going to say, okay, padlock is gone. I'm now at revision C. Once we move beyond Vault Basic, we're still within those three areas, metadata, process, and files. But now we're leveraging them to work together to automate some things just a little bit. Now we're leveraging it so that when I update the metadata, it's automatically updating, it's automatically kicking off a process so that we have that level of control that we're looking for and that we are updating other pieces of metadata. So we've moved beyond the idea of just here's a file to here's all this extended information, and that extended information is automatically being managed as part of this. While I'm staying right here and talking about the idea of access and control, I'm just going to jump in here real quick and take a look at the level of security that's on here. I can come along and I can do this at so many different levels, but I'll just look at it a simple one here. I can take a particular user, and just like I could with Windows, I can say whether they're allowed to read the files in that particular folder or not. I can also say whether they're allowed to modify the files, whether they're allowed to delete files. So maybe I can say, well, you can get in there, you can look at the files, you can even change them, but you can't delete them. Or I could determine whether or not they're also allowed to download the files from there as well. So I've got several, and this can go down, I'm doing this on an individual file. We could do this at a group level. We can do this at a folder level. We can have those levels of control right across the board. We can even say that when it's in a particular state, released, in review, out to customer, whatever we want to call that state, when it's in that particular state, it's allowed, only certain people are allowed to access it. Only certain people are allowed to download it. Only certain people are allowed to edit that particular file. So those levels of control increase as we go up. Again, it's all about those three basic things. We're just seeing different ways of accessing them. I'm going to take a look at one other quick item with this, and then I'm going to step back a little bit and talk about some other things. So moving along that idea of processes, we can go further and include engineering change orders that are become in as part of that. So with an engineering change order, we now have the process where we could step through, we could put a file in a change order, alert people that changes need to be made, collect approvals. This can automate emails as it goes and send that out, and all of it occurs right within the same approval cycle. So it's all part of the same internal process with the same internal information that's part of that. So this is just one more way that we can deal with those processes within there. The last thing I'd mention about Vault Professional, as it differs from Vault Basic, is the idea of being able to extend the reach of this. So instead of just having it within a single environment, this can actually be replicated out to multiple servers, to multiple environments. So now, instead of a single file store, we can have multiple file stores that people are accessing in multiple locations so that they can go get to those. So As I mentioned, all comes down to those three basic things. What we're seeing is just different ways of accessing those same three things every single time. When we're looking at that top level, that's all it really comes down to. Where are the files, the information about the files, and then processes around them. As we use these different tools, they do extend out so that we can have greater levels of access to each of those. What's interesting is the digital files themselves, it all kind of stays the same. We put them in the vault, they're in a single location, great. From there, it's the metadata and processes that really change as we look at different levels of vault and different ways of accessing that information. So whether we've got it in a single server or whether we've got it on multiple servers, whether we're just checking it out or we also want to control it with life cycles and all of that information, it's really kind of the same file. The file itself is the simple part of this. The interesting thing is getting those other pieces in place. And that's why when we look at this, when we want to put Vault in, we want to look at the idea of what makes a successful implementation of Vault overall. When we're going and we want to put this in place so that we can really have all this information. It's not as simple as installing the software. It's not as simple as putting the files somewhere. It gets much deeper than that, and we need to understand all of those pieces. So IMAGINiT does 50 to 75 Vault implementations or upgrades every year. And we always follow the same basic path to that. This is an incredibly high level idea of what that path would look like. But we have the idea of these configuration and planning meetings where we define all of those things. What files are we putting in? What users are going to access them? What metadata goes around them? What levels of control do we need? Then we have the idea of IT function of installing this information, installing the server, getting that set up. Then we go through and configure all of those pieces, go through testing, and go through training. I just wanted to point that out. This definitely isn't a, this originally, and this is years ago when Vault was first coming out, people would say, oh, can we do a test of this? Well, it's not just a real quick install it and let's see what it does. There's a lot to this. How are we actually going to use it? So when we're looking at that kind of holistic idea, it's not just where the file is going to go. It's all the other pieces too, and it's a series of conversations that need to be had both within your company internally and then with the technicians, with the people who are ultimately going to install this and put this in as part of a larger system. So that's kind of the big broad overview I wanted to talk about. The three pieces that really need to be concerned with when we're looking at data management, and then two of the tools that Autodesk has that can assist with that and bring that information in. Those are all really powerful tools that we can begin using to access that. What I'm going to do is, looks like I'm about 5 minutes early, but I'm going to go ahead and we will open it up to see if there's any questions. Oh, went the wrong way. Any questions on some of the topics that I have there?